AOC was lecturing about transparency when Kennedy pulled out her redacted financial form. What he asked next left her speechless. The mahogany-paneled conference room deep within the Capitol building felt more like a confessional than a meeting space, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward in her leather chair, her voice carrying the passionate conviction that had made her a political phenomenon. The invitation-only ethics workshop was supposed to be a quiet, bipartisan discussion about accountability and public service, but AOC was about to turn it into something much more explosive. Some folks in rooms like this, she began, her gaze sweeping across the table with surgical precision, have had the benefit of systems that seemed tailor-made for their success from the start. Rules and pathways that opened up naturally without the need to question or fight every step. The room of senators and representatives fell silent, the weight of her words settling like a heavy blanket over the polished wooden table. AOC's signature red lipstick caught the soft overhead lighting as she paused for effect, her brown eyes locking onto the faces around her with the intensity of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. But what AOC didn't know was that Senator John Kennedy had been waiting for exactly this moment. Seated directly across from her, the 73-year-old Louisiana senator appeared completely relaxed, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the light as he rested his hands calmly on a leather briefcase that had been his silent companion throughout the meeting. While other participants shifted uncomfortably in their seats or glanced at their notes, Kennedy remained perfectly still, his pale blue eyes fixed on AOC with the steady gaze of a chess master watching his opponent walk directly into a trap he'd spent months preparing. The ethics workshop had been AOC's idea, sold to leadership as a necessary discussion about transparency and accountability in modern governance. She'd specifically requested Kennedy's inclusion, believing that his old-school Southern approach to politics represented everything wrong with the Washington establishment. In her mind, this was going to be her opportunity to educate the room about privilege, systemic bias, and the need for fresh perspectives in government. She had no idea that Kennedy had spent the past 3 weeks conducting his own investigation into her financial disclosures. For others, AOC continued, her voice rising with righteous indignation, it's been a different story, one of pushing against walls that weren't built with us in mind. And when we advocate for changes to make things more equitable, it can feel like we're being accused of disrupting the status quo when all we're doing is asking for a seat at the table that's been promised to everyone. A few participants nodded in agreement, while others maintained carefully neutral expressions. The retired federal judge moderating the session scribbled notes on his legal pad, seemingly fascinated by the direction the conversation was taking. But Kennedy's attention never wavered from AOC, his expression as calm and unreadable as still water. AOC was just getting started. This goes beyond just following codes on paper, she declared, her voice taking on the teaching tone that her millions of social media followers knew well. It's about recognizing the underlying patterns that influence how we operate day to day, patterns that might appear neutral on the surface, but often carry echoes of exclusion, especially from certain perspectives or regions where tradition holds strong sway. The indirect reference to the South, and by extension to Kennedy himself, hung in the air like smoke. Several participants glanced nervously between AOC and Kennedy, waiting for the explosion that would surely follow such a pointed accusation. But Kennedy simply smiled his gentle grandfatherly smile and reached for his briefcase. What happened next would expose AOC's hypocrisy in the most devastating way possible. With movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed, Kennedy opened his briefcase and withdrew a single document. The paper was crisp and official-looking, bearing the unmistakable letterhead of congressional financial disclosure forms. But what made every person in the room lean forward with sudden interest was the bold black rectangle that dominated the center of the page, a redaction stamp that read, "See Unfidential Section 4 with HEL Dill." Kennedy placed the document face up in the center of the table with the care of a man handling evidence in a murder trial. The silence that followed was so complete that the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed deafeningly loud. AOC's eyes fell on the document, and for the first time since the meeting began, her confident expression faltered. The color drained from her cheeks as she recognized her own signature at the bottom of the page, and the date stamp that showed this was her most recent quarterly financial disclosure, the one she'd filed just 3 weeks earlier. Kennedy adjusted his glasses with infinite patience, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the tension like a warm knife through butter. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle politeness he might use to ask someone to pass the sweet tea. Since we're discussing transparency and the importance of recognizing our own patterns, he paused, letting the anticipation build as every eye in the room fixed on the redacted document. Could you help us understand who assisted you in completing Section 4 of this form, and why it required such extensive confidentiality measures? The question landed like a precision strike. 7 simple words that cut through AOC's carefully constructed narrative about transparency and accountability, exposing the gap between her public persona and her private actions. AOC's mouth opened, but no words came out. For a woman who had built her career on quick-witted responses and viral soundbites, the silence stretched into an eternity. Her fingers drummed nervously on the table as her mind raced, trying to find a way to explain why she had redacted an entire section of her financial disclosure while simultaneously lecturing others about transparency. But Kennedy wasn't finished. With the same methodical precision, he reached into his briefcase again and produced a second document, this one a printout of one of AOC's recent tweets, dated just 5 days earlier. "Transparency isn't just a buzzword," Kennedy read aloud, his voice carrying across the silent room. "It's the foundation of trust between public servants and the people we represent. No exceptions, no excuses, no redactions." The irony was so perfect, so devastating, that several participants audibly gasped. AOC had literally tweeted about the importance of avoiding redactions while sitting on a heavily redacted financial disclosure that she'd filed under mysterious circumstances. The most shocking moment was yet to come. Kennedy set down the printed tweet and looked directly at AOC, his pale eyes filled with something that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't cruelty either, more like the patient disappointment of a teacher whose star student had been caught cheating. "Representative," he said, his drawl seeming to slow time itself, "I'm curious about the consulting firm listed in the unredacted portions. Progressive Strategies LLC, a company that appears to have been incorporated just 2 days before you filed this disclosure, with an address that, according to public records, is a mailbox rental in Delaware." AOC's face went from pale to ashen. The consulting firm was supposed to be her secret, a way to funnel speaking fees and advisory payments from wealthy progressive donors without triggering the more stringent disclosure requirements that applied to direct donations. Her lawyers had assured her that the redaction would protect the details, that no one would dig deep enough to connect the dots. But Kennedy had done more than dig. He'd excavated. The firm's sole listed employee, Kennedy continued with the relentless patience of a coroner conducting an autopsy, is one Madison Torres Chen, who, according to LinkedIn, is a 22-year-old recent graduate with a degree in, yet Progressive Strategies LLC has somehow managed to pay you $47,000 over the past 6 months for what's described as policy consultation services. The room erupted in whispers. $47,000 was serious money, enough to trigger multiple disclosure requirements that AOC had apparently sidestepped through creative paperwork. Kennedy reached into his briefcase one final time, producing a photograph that he placed next to the other documents. It showed AOC at a high-end restaurant in Manhattan, laughing over champagne with a group of well-dressed individuals that included several recognizable tech billionaires and Wall Street executives. This photograph, Kennedy said, his voice never rising above conversational level, was taken last month at Le Bernardin, where the tasting menu runs about $300 per person. The dinner was organized by Progressive Strategies LLC, according to the reservation, and featured what one attendee described to me as informal policy discussions about cryptocurrency regulation and tax reform. AOC finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Senator, this is a personal attack." Kennedy's expression didn't change. "Representative, this is transparency, the kind you were just advocating for, recognizing patterns that might appear neutral on the surface but carry deeper implications." The devastation was complete. In less than 5 minutes, Kennedy had used AOC's own words and her own redacted documents to expose a level of hypocrisy so profound that it left her completely speechless. The woman who had built her brand on fighting against corruption and demanding transparency from others had been caught operating her own shadowy consulting arrangement, taking money from the very wealthy elites she publicly criticized. But Kennedy had one final blow to deliver. "I have to ask, Representative," he said, his voice maintaining that same gentle, grandfatherly tone that made his words even more devastating, "when you speak about walls that weren't built with us in mind, and systems tailor-made for success, Are you referring to the same system that allowed you to create a shell company in Delaware, accept payments from billionaire donors, and redact the details from public view? The silence that followed was deafening. AOC sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with the look of someone who had just realized they'd walked into an ambush so perfectly orchestrated that escape was impossible. The moderator, clearly out of his depth, cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. But Kennedy held up a gentle hand. Actually, Your Honor, I think this is exactly the kind of discussion we came here to have. The representative raised important questions about transparency and accountability. I'm simply wondering if those same standards apply to everyone in this room. What happened in the next 10 minutes would end AOC's reputation as a champion of transparency forever. AOC finally managed to speak, her voice shaky and defensive. Senator Kennedy, you're taking things out of context. Progressive Strategies is a legitimate consulting firm that helps connect policymakers with grassroots organizations. Kennedy nodded thoughtfully, then reached for yet another document from his seemingly bottomless briefcase. I see. And could you explain how grassroots organizations managed to pay this firm through wire transfers from accounts held by Goldstone Capital Management and the Hamptons Progressive Fund? The blood drained from AOC's face completely. Those were the names of two ultra-exclusive investment funds that catered to the wealthiest progressives in New York, exactly the kind of establishment elites that AOC had built her career opposing. The Hamptons Progressive Fund, Kennedy continued with scholarly precision, is particularly interesting. Founded by tech billionaire Marcus Chen, the same Marcus Chen who was seated to your left in that photograph from Le Bernardin. The same Marcus Chen who, according to Federal Election Commission records, has given the maximum allowable donation to every single one of your campaigns. A Republican congressman from Texas leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Are you saying she's been taking money from billionaires while campaigning against billionaire influence? Kennedy's smile was gentle but deadly. I'm not saying anything, Congressman. I'm simply asking Representative Ocasio-Cortez to help us understand how this arrangement fits with her advocacy for transparency. OOC tried one more desperate deflection. This is exactly the kind of gotcha politics that prevents real progress. Instead of attacking me personally, maybe we should focus on the systemic issues I was discussing. But Kennedy was ready for that too. He produced a final document, a printout from AOC's own website, dated less than a month earlier. I will never accept money from corporate PACs or special interest groups, he read aloud. My campaign is funded by small-dollar donations from working families, not backroom deals with wealthy elites. Unlike my opponents, I don't hide my funding sources behind shell companies or redacted disclosures. The hypocrisy was so blatant, so undeniable, that several participants actually laughed out loud. AOC had literally promised never to hide funding sources behind shell companies while actively operating her own shell company to hide funding sources. Kennedy looked up from the printout, his expression filled with what could only be described as disappointed paternal concern. Representative, could you help us reconcile these statements with the Progressive Strategies arrangement? AOC's political career had just been destroyed by her own words, her own documents, and her own hypocrisy. The woman who had lectured others about transparency had been caught operating in the shadows. The populist champion who claimed to fight for working families had been taking money from billionaires at $300 per person dinners. And John Kennedy had orchestrated the entire revelation with the methodical precision of a master strategist, using nothing but publicly available documents and AOC's own public statements to expose the fraud at the heart of her political brand. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within hours of the ethics workshop ending, leaked audio from the session began circulating on social media. The recording of Kennedy's methodical destruction of AOC's credibility went viral faster than any of her previous tweets, racking up millions of views as people shared the devastating moment when her own words and documents were used to expose her hypocrisy. Conservative outlets led with headlines like AOC caught in billionaire money scheme and progressive champion exposed as elite puppet. But more damaging were the reactions from her own supporters, who felt betrayed by the revelation that their anti-establishment hero had been secretly taking money from the very establishment she claimed to oppose. Her attempts to control the narrative fell flat. A hastily organized press conference where she tried to explain the Progressive Strategies arrangement only made things worse, as reporters pelted her with questions about the Delaware Shell Company, the Hamptons Progressive Fund, and the $300 per person dinners with tech billionaires. This is a distraction from the real issues, she insisted. but the defense sounded hollow coming from someone who had built her career on exposing exactly these kinds of financial arrangements when practiced by Republicans. Social media, which had once been AOC's greatest weapon, turned against her with brutal efficiency. The hashtag progressive strategies began trending worldwide, filled with memes mocking her hypocrisy and side-by-side comparisons of her anti-corruption tweets with images of her dining with billionaires. Her approval rating, which had remained remarkably stable throughout her congressional career, plummeted 23 points in just 2 weeks. More devastating still, the decline was sharpest among her core supporters, young progressives who had believed in her authenticity and were now discovering that their champion had been playing the same game as everyone else, just with better PR. Primary challengers immediately began emerging in her district, funded by small-dollar donations from former AOC supporters who felt betrayed by her secret money arrangements. The woman who had once seemed politically untouchable was suddenly facing the very real possibility of losing her seat to someone who promised to actually practice the transparency she had only preached. Kennedy, for his part, said nothing. He didn't need to gloat or pile on. The documents spoke for themselves. When reporters asked him about the ethics workshop, he simply smiled and said, "I believe in holding everyone to the same standards, regardless of party. That's what the people deserve." The investigation that followed revealed even more damaging details about Progressive Strategies LLC. The consulting firm had received payments not just from tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, but from pharmaceutical companies seeking to influence AOC's position on drug pricing reform, and defense contractors hoping to shape her views on military spending. Each revelation further undermined AOC's brand as an incorruptible outsider fighting against special interests. The woman who had once seemed to represent a new kind of politics was exposed as just another politician who said one thing in public while doing another in private. 6 months later, AOC announced she would not seek re-election, citing a desire to focus on grassroots organizing outside the constraints of electoral politics. But everyone understood what had really happened. John Kennedy had ended her political career with nothing more than a briefcase full of documents and the patience to let her own words convict her. The lesson was clear and brutal. In the age of transparency, hypocrisy is a career-ending disease. And no one was better at diagnosing that disease than John Kennedy, who had proven that sometimes the most devastating political attack isn't an attack at all. It's simply holding a mirror up to your opponent and letting them see their own reflection. AOC's downfall became a case study in political hubris, a cautionary tale about the dangers of building a brand on moral superiority while secretly engaging in the very behaviors you publicly condemn. Her name became synonymous with progressive hypocrisy, and her carefully constructed image as an authentic outsider was revealed to be nothing more than sophisticated marketing. Meanwhile, Kennedy's reputation as a master of quiet, devastating political tactics only grew. Colleagues began seeking his advice on how to handle their own ethical challenges, knowing that his approach, methodical, factual, and utterly damning, represented the gold standard for political accountability. The ethics workshop that AOC had intended as a platform for lecturing others about privilege and transparency had instead become the stage for her own public execution, carried out with surgical precision by a 73-year-old senator who proved that in politics, as in chess, the most dangerous opponents are the ones who let you think you're winning right up until the moment they destroy you. And it had all started with a single document, placed calmly on a mahogany table, by a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon in politics isn't anger or outrage, it's the simple, devastating truth.